Good morning. Quorum being present, the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to the first subcommittee hearing of the new year. After replacing No Child Left Behind at the end of 2015, I think it's only fitting to kick off 2016 with a conversation about what happens next. After years of flawed policies and federal intrusions into the nation's classrooms, Congress passed the Every Student Succeeds Act based on the principle that responsibility of K-12 education must be returned to state and local leaders. The new law repeals onerous federal requirements and ensures important decisions that affect education, like standards, accountability, school improvement, are made by state and local leaders, not Washington bureaucrats. That's why the Wall Street Journal editorial board described the legislation as, quote, the largest devolution of power to the states in a quarter century, unquote, and why the National Governors Association lauded the new law as a, quote, historic moment in ensuring children's future success in the nation's schools, unquote. There's no question that replacing No Child Left Behind was an important achievement, one that will improve K-12 education for students and families. But our work is far from finished. In fact, it's just beginning. Over the last several years, the administration has routinely taken a top-down approach to education, imposing on states and school districts a backdoor agenda that has sparked bipartisan opposition and harmed education reform efforts. The passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act puts states and school districts back in charge of education and includes more than 50 pages of provisions to keep the Department of Education in check. For example, the law protects the right of state and local leaders to determine what standards, assessments, and curriculum are best for their students and ensures state and local leaders are responsible for accountability and school improvement. Now, moving forward, it's going to be our collective responsibility to hold the Department of Education accountable for how it implements the law. This is what Congress does and is supposed to do. Congress promised to restore state and local control over K-12 education, and now it's our job to ensure that that promise is kept. Hearing from you, the very leaders we want to empower, is a critical part of that effort. What role do state and local leaders play in implementing the law is a question. What challenges do you anticipate state and school districts may face is another question. How can the department provide the increased flexibility and autonomy state and local leaders were promised and now expect? Today's conversation is one of many steps we plan to take to ensure the department upholds the letter and spirit of the law that we passed and that the President signed. And answers to these questions will inform our efforts moving forward. It's my firm belief that when the Every Student Succeeds Act is implemented as Congress intended, parents, teachers, and state and local leaders will be empowered to deliver the excellent education, in fact, every child deserves. And with that, again, I welcome everybody and will yield to Ranking Member Fudge for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm pleased to be here to discuss the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. I do believe that this bipartisan law will fulfill the Elementary and Secondary Education Act's promise to promote and protect the right to educational opportunity for all the nation's most vulnerable children. We worked across the aisle to write this law over many months and years, and I am pleased with the role House Democrats played to strengthen the final conference report and secure the President's signature. I look forward to working with you, the administration, and with stakeholders to preserve the law's civil rights legacy during implementation. The Every Student Succeeds Act provides the much-needed flexibility absent in No Child Left Behind's one-size-fits-all requirements, but maintains critical federal protections to ensure that every child has access to a quality education. This is particularly important for students of color, English language learners, students with disabilities, and low-income students who disproportionately face barriers to a quality education that prepares them for college and a career. Under ESSA, states and local school districts will have the flexibility to design multi-measure accountability systems, make important decisions about standards and assessments, and ensure that school intervention and support strategies are improving outcomes for students. But with new flexibility comes responsibility. States and school districts will need to implement ESSA in a way that continues its focus on meeting the needs of our nation's most at-risk students. The work will not be easy. The voices of our communities will be vital in determining the parameters of implementation. Parents, teachers, and students will need to elevate their voices and experiences at school board meetings and state capitals across the country. State and local leaders will need to fight for strong student-focused policies. And the U.S. Department of Education will need to ensure that states are putting children's needs first. As ESSA is implemented, stakeholder input will continue to be important. I was pleased to see that 370 organizations and individuals provided recommendations to the U.S. Department of Education regarding the regulatory process. Many stakeholders ask for additional clarity through regulations on issues including, but not limited to, defining vague terms, setting parameters, and providing options to fulfill legal requirements in ESSA. Many stakeholders also requested a timeline to help states and school districts plan for the transition. I believe such a timeline is a critical component of the process. Federal agencies are required to faithfully implement the law. I am pleased that the U.S. Department of Education has started the process of issuing regulations and guidance to assist states and school districts with implementing the Every Student Succeeds Act. States and school districts need clarity, rules, and oversight throughout the implementation process to ensure that the law fulfills ESSA's promise. While some things like annual assessments and disaggregated data will remain the same, there will be many new requirements, and the federal guidance will empower states to hit the ground running. I look forward to hearing about the panel's experiences and their recommendations for ensuring a smooth and successful transition in a way that preserves the critical federal role in promoting educational equity. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for the 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I will now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses, and I ask Mr. Russell of Oklahoma to introduce our first witness.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my honor this morning to welcome to the committee the State Superintendent of Public Instruction for the great state of Oklahoma, Ms. Joy Hoffmeister, a friend. She comes with a wealth of experience and background, not only as a public school teacher, but also as a small business owner. She served on the State Board of Education. She's worked tirelessly getting out in the school districts to listen to what the standards concerns are, the importance of having state control for these standards, and it is my honor to welcome her to this committee this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Welcome. I'll continue with introductions. Dr. Paul Vic Wilson serves as the superintendent for the Hartselle City Board of Education, Hartselle, Alabama. Previous to serving as superintendent, Dr. Wilson was a high school principal at Mountain Brook High School. Ms. Celine Almazan serves as legal director for the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, COPAA, in Towson, Maryland. For the last 20 years, Ms. Almazan has represented parents in special education matters with a primary focus on least restrictive environment issues, individualized education plan team meetings, state complaint proceedings, mediations, due process hearings, suspension and expulsion proceedings, and federal court proceedings. Welcome. Mr. Kent Talbert serves as an attorney in Washington, D.C., where he provides advice on education law and policy covering pre-K through post-secondary education issues. In addition, Mr. Talbert served as the general counsel for the U.S. Department of Education from 2006 to 2009 and also served with this committee. Welcome all. I will now ask our witnesses to stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect witnesses answered in the affirmative, and you may be seated. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me briefly explain our lighting system. You each have 5 minutes to present your testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will be green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow, and when your time has expired, it will be red. At that point, I'll ask you to wrap up your remarks as best as you are able. And by the way, this is a reminder for us up here as well, not just you all. Members then will each have 5 minutes to ask questions. And with that, Ms. Hoffmeister, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Klein. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Rakita, Ranking Member Fudge, as well as the introduction from my Congressman Russell and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. And congratulations on the successful passage of Every Student Succeeds Act. As Oklahoma State Superintendent, I embrace the challenge to successfully implement this important new law. My goal is to ensure all Oklahoma students have access to a high-quality education. To do so, we have set out on an ambitious path to focus on early childhood foundations and literacy, to close achievement gaps and opportunity gaps, and to increase the number of high school graduates fully prepared for the challenges of a post-secondary education or the workforce. Passage of this new law could not have come at a better time to give us the flexibility and authority needed to achieve these goals. Prior to the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, Oklahoma struggled to realize the full potential of every child. Why? While we set ambitious goals and created meaningful programs to meet those goals, we faced a prescriptive federal law that offered neither the space nor the flexibility to do what we needed to do on behalf of kids. Today, however, my fellow state chiefs and I look forward to both the flexibility and stability of this new law so we can create accountability systems, school-level interventions, and educator evaluation and support frameworks to achieve the goals we have set for all students in our states. This law signals a new era of federal policy and education, one that lets those at the state and local levels, those closest to the classrooms, focus their efforts on reaching the best outcomes for all students while still holding us accountable for results for kids. States like Oklahoma will only be able to achieve the full promise of this new law if the federal government continues to hold true to the spirit of the law. If we truly are allowed to innovate, free from regulations and guidelines that change the intent of this body, striking the balance between guidance to the states and ensuring that states are not overly prescribed is what state leaders need. I realize that some regulation and guidance are necessary as states transition to the new law. For example, I know states will welcome clarification on such issues as the timeline for implementation. And I want to recognize the U.S. Department of Education already, as they have taken steps to provide some clarity on key issues, such as the recent guidance on how states can transition away from highly qualified teacher regulations. I applaud these positive signs from the department and appreciate their efforts to leave these necessary decisions up to states and local communities. Under No Child Left Behind, states quickly realized that academic progress was stalling under an outdated law. We first noticed the lag in our accountability systems. Because these systems relied solely on the number of kids passing one test each year, we could not accurately identify all schools in need of improvement. Moreover, once schools were identified, we saw that what may work for school improvement in Oklahoma City or in Tulsa was not the same as what was needed or might work in Guyman or Muskogee. Oklahoma has a new day, and we know that now under the new Every Student Succeeds Act, Oklahoma plans to build on the progress we made through our ESEA flexibility waiver to create a better system for all kids, an accountability system that better identifies schools and what assistance they need, more targeted interventions that recognize not every student or community is the same, and complete authority to craft an evaluation and support system that truly evaluates and supports Oklahoma teachers amidst the reality of a historic teacher shortage. Let me leave you with this final thought. States are not only ready, but we are willing and able to lead under this new law. We have proven it time and time again as we have raised academic standards for every child, created better assessments to meet individual needs, and sought additional flexibility to do what is best for all kids in our states. What we need today is for Congress and the U.S. Department of Education to continue to recognize our leadership as we work with parents, teachers, and key stakeholders to transition to this new law. Future regulations should not focus on providing states with, should focus, on on providing states with guidance, clarification, and support, but not prescription and compliance. I look forward to this opportunity to focus on what needs to be done to give every Oklahoma child a first-rate education. Under this new law, I now see the federal government as a partner in this effort, not a barrier. I hope we can work together to keep it that way. Thank you, and I'm available for answering any questions you may have at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you about the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which resulted in the passage of Every Student Succeeds Act. My name is Vic Wilson, Superintendent of Hartselle City Schools, and I come to you today representing AASA, the School Superintendents Association, School Superintendents of Alabama, and the Hartselle City Schools. ESSA signifies a wonderful step in the right direction to return autonomy and decision-making to the state and local level. Just as former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill observed, all politics is local. I contend all education is local as well, and best delivered and administered at the local level by educational professionals and stakeholders who know and understand the intricacies of not only local politics, but local education. Certainly a role exists for the United States Education Department, a role focused on strengthening and supporting public schools by equitably applying broad flexibility to states and local districts in their efforts to meet the needs of the stakeholders under their purview. ESSA represents the first time in 15 years that state and local education agencies can demonstrate what they can do to support student learning without federal overreach. Throughout the United States, the nation's 14,000 public school superintendents are charged with meeting and exceeding expectations of student achievement and learning for stakeholders at the local level. What works in Alabama might not work and might be slightly different from what works in Minnesota. Likewise, what works in Hartselle, Alabama might differ slightly from what works in Florence, Alabama or Arley, Alabama. ESSA provides a new opportunity for each of those leaders who craft and implement customized education for learners in their district. In Hartselle City Schools, we strive to meet the needs of students who want to be a rocket scientist, the student who wants to be a doctor, the student who wants to be a welder, the student who wants to work in public service, or the student who really doesn't know what he or she wants to be at that time, and perhaps even the student who wants to become a teacher. Thanks to the flexibility given to us by the Alabama State Department of Education and now ESSA, we are able to do this by collaborating as necessary with local entities and other school systems across the state. We're even able to converse and collaborate with leaders across the nation to see how these ideas are working in one region of the country and how they might be applied in our area. This works best on an organic level via networking conducted by local leaders instead of top-down mandates, and ESSA allows and encourages this type of collaborative dialogue. Last week, Superintendent Bill Hopkins, Superintendent Ed Nichols, and I met in Montgomery with superintendents across our state at our legislative conference. While all three of us reside in Morgan County, we each have differences with which we must deal on a daily basis. Without the ability to implement guidelines that best fit the needs of our respective district students, we would be forced to work with round holes and square pegs far too often. Every leader needs the flexibility to deal with those situations that are unique to their district in a manner that best meets the need. Superintendent Janet Womack will deal with issues in Florence City differently than Ed, Bill, or I will, and rightly so. ESSA is a huge step in this direction and will serve leaders as they strive to lead all learners up the stairs of success. When it comes to federal regulations and ESSA, less is more. I strongly encourage the USED to incorporate input and feedback from stakeholders before adding regulations that could hamper their state and local decision-making. In Alabama, Dr. Bice implemented Plan 2020 that has greatly increased local control and has resulted in great growth across our state. Our graduation rates are going up, our dropout rates and recidivism rates are going down. For example, by re-examining rules and regulations that tie seat time to credit-bearing courses or regulations that ignore competency-based accountability systems, the United States Education Department can empower school districts to think outside the box and implement procedures and policies that best meet the needs of schools and the students they serve. Hartselle City Schools, the SSA, and the AASA, and other agencies concur about the importance of implementing ESSA in a manner that reflects the expanded authority and flexibility now granted to the experts at the state and local level. ESSA makes it clear that Congress' intent is that states should be solely responsible for decisions regarding accountability, standards, teachers, and other factors. Essentially, ESSA is a codification of the reality that one size does not fit all, and there truly is not one best model that will serve all students and schools. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today and submit these comments. My goal today has been to highlight the importance of ensuring the state and local education agencies have local control when deciding among the myriad options available in delivering quality instruction and meeting the needs of all the students. By allowing this broad flexibility to the states and local agencies, ESSA will go a long way in transforming public education at the local and state level and thereby propelling public education forward nationally. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Almazan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Klein, Chairman Rokita, Ranking Member Scott, and Ranking Member Fudge, and members of the committee. I am Celine Almazan, Legal Director of the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, a national nonprofit whose mission is to protect the civil rights of 6.4 million children with disabilities attending our nation's public schools. I am also a parent to 3 children. 2 of my children have disabilities and attended Maryland public schools. I understand the impact of high expectations for students with disabilities and students of color through the lives of my clients and know firsthand the impact of high expectations for my own children. A client of mine, Georgia, now age 12, was placed in a segregated classroom with no access to high-quality instruction. She's African American. Georgia has a rare genetic condition that impacts her in many ways, but does not impact her desire to learn. We worked to have her moved to general education classrooms. With the right supports and access to trained teachers and high expectations, she flourished. Georgia is not alone in her quest. The need to demand high expectations in order to have the opportunity to achieve has a profound impact on the lives of many students and their families, my own included. Over the past several years, COPA has worked with disabilities, civil rights, and business communities to ensure that ESEA, now known as the ESSA, fully supports Black, Hispanic, low-income, English learners, and students with disabilities to succeed. Key to our collective support has been that the Secretary of Education approves plans and ensures state implementation, and that states take action when schools and districts fail to meet their obligations. Includes annual statewide assessments, has a strict statewide participation cap at 1% of all students on the subject on the use of alternate assessments, includes a requirement to assess at least 95% of all students, includes statewide accountability systems with achievement and graduation goals, and requires action when any group of students consistently underperforms. My testimony today intends to accomplish 2 priorities. Priority number 1, the role of the Department of Education is vital in the implementation of ESSA. While Section 1111E of ESSA includes specific limited restrictions on federal prescription, COPA and its civil rights coalition partners are confident that the provisions therein are specific and limited enough as to not erode the regulatory authority of the Secretary. ESSA acknowledges that regulations will be promulgated, and in so doing, the Secretary will use regulations that protect the rights of all children without exceeding the scope of and without being inconsistent with the statute. It is clear that the U.S. Department of Education has the correct regulatory authority to develop recommendations for implementation. In its simplest form, regulation allocates responsibility to implement statutory law. On priority 2, COPA takes seriously the impact Title I implementation has on students. We understand states will have more discretion in carrying out ESSA. However, COPA, along with our partners in the business, civil rights, and disability community, have and will work to prevent efforts to water down expectations, avoid full transparency, diminish the importance of honest measures, or delay interventions when any group of students is struggling. COPA submitted comprehensive recommendations to the Secretary on ESSA Title I. We believe it is imperative that the Secretary exercise full legal authority to issue regulations on key Title I provisions, including to clarify and define new statutory terms and provide parameters on the end size to protect the integrity of accountability and assessment systems, specify the 95% participation requirement is included in accountability, establish the statutory state cap at 1% of all students for use in alternate assessments, recognize district flexibility, and create strict criteria for any state waiver. Assure state and district-led evidence-based interventions systems are focused on raising achievement and are initiated whenever any school is underperforming for all students or for any student group. The ESAA is our nation's most important civil rights law. While ESSA does include new flexibility, it also includes bright-line requirements that the civil rights and business community help support. The department must now provide clarifying rules so states can implement the law in a way that honors the purpose of the bill, but also holds states accountable for access to over $15 billion in federal funds. Federal funds are still conditional and through compliance with the law, and there's agreement that the Secretary has the authority to define, monitor, and enforce the law. Student rights and educational opportunity must not be compromised by politics that seek to ignore the foundational tenet of administrative law. We want to help states and districts create new opportunities to accelerate student progress for our most vulnerable groups of children. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Talbot, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rokita, Ranking Member Fudge, Chairman Klein, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be here to present testimony on implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. In my past role as General Counsel, one of my tasks was to advise the Secretary of Education on the contours of newly enacted laws. In other words, what are the boundaries or the scope of the text? This is a lot like a football field. The field has boundaries within which the game is played, and so too, any new law must be interpreted within the confines of the text. The process of advising the Secretary necessarily involves making judgments about whether proposed regulatory actions or guidance or other implementation decisions are within the scope of the words of the statute. This generally involves taking a close look at the particular text, as well as looking at the text in light of the whole. One question that sometimes arises is, what happens if a regulation is drafted in a manner that's outside the scope of the text? The answer is a department or agency may risk a potential lawsuit. And so there's potential that the regulation could be set aside by a court. Or in the case of guidance, there's a risk that it could be declared a legislative rule, in effect, a regulation. And in this latter case, a court may require a department or agency to go back and do notice and comment rulemaking. And so it's within this context that I present my testimony. I have 3 things that I'll focus on. The first is the law's broad shift in authority to states and school districts. Secondly, I'll share a few thoughts on implementation. And third, I will conclude with a brief discussion of some of the prohibitions in Title VIII of the law. With respect to the shift in authority to states and school districts, without question, the new law provides states with the authority to design accountability systems from the ground up. In effect, the states become the design engineers operating within broad federal guidelines, and then they proceed to build these systems. In addition, the law's shift in authority can be seen in the multiple affirmations of the state-level direction over standards and assessments, and in the prohibitions that are placed upon the federal government's involvement in standards, assessments, and curriculum. I'll talk about some of those prohibitions in a little more detail in a few minutes, but for now, I would note that the new law does prohibit the federal government from mandating, directing, or requiring Common Core state standards, as well as any other assessments aligned to such standards. Similarly, no funds may be used for developing, incentivizing, administering, and so forth of any federally sponsored national test unless it's expressly authorized in the law. For example, NAEP would be one of those that's expressly authorized in the law. A third aspect of the shift to states and school districts can be found in the waiver authority. New language was added to Section 8401 to make clear that the federal government may not disapprove a waiver request based on conditions that are outside the scope of the waiver that's requested, nor may the Secretary require as a condition of waiver approval an applicant to use Common Core standards or use specific assessments such as those aligned to the Common Core, nor include in or delete from a waiver request specific elements of state academic standards, assessments, accountability systems, or teacher evaluation systems. Turning now to implementation, where I'm providing advice to those charged with implementation, I would note the primary importance of the text in any interpretive challenge. Ultimately, fidelity to the text will prove critical in any legal dispute. And so in reading the text of Every Student Succeeds Act, one should be aware of and distinguish between things such as purpose statements, express program requirements, rules of construction, findings, as well as sense of the Congress provisions. Likewise, in thinking through implementation, one should be apprised of the various canons of construction. 3 examples of rules of construction are the plain meaning rule, the rule of non-retroactivity, and the harmonization of disparate text to the extent you can harmonize different provisions. One should also give attention to the words that are used, shall versus may, and then such things as grammar and punctuation. Separate and apart from consideration of the text is the legislative history that's involved in order to provide as complete a picture as possible to senior officers and so forth. I would recommend that they carefully review, prior to implementation and rulemaking, all the relevant parts of committee reports, floor debates, conference reports, and the like. They are particularly helpful in understanding the broader background and context of the law. With respect to Title VIII's general provisions, and to conclude, I would advise careful attention to these. They often deal with discrete, sometimes controversial topics. They include prohibitions, limitations, and commentary on a host of issues. Some have been in the law for years, others are new, others are modified. Most are generally straightforward and unequivocal. For example, officers or employees of the federal government, whether through grant, contract, or cooperative agreement, are prohibited from mandating, directing, and controlling, so forth, a school district or schools' programs of instruction, standards, assessments, and the like. This also includes prohibitions relating to the Common Core standards, and states cannot be penalized for withdrawing from the Common Core.
Mr. Talbert, I need to cut you off. 5 minutes is up, but I'm sure we'll come back to your testimony and questions, so thank you very much. Thank you. I thank all the witnesses. As I often do, I'm going to defer my questions to the end and recognize other members of the committee first. First and foremost being the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Klein from Minnesota, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. We're very excited and interested to follow the implementation of ESSA. As all of you know, it was years in the making. There was bipartisan agreement that we wanted to have a devolution of power from the federal government back to states and local governments. Our concern has been, my concern has been, as we go into implementation, that there may be misinterpretations, Mr. Talbot was just talking about. It is possible that some states will end up with No Child Left Behind light. I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But it was my belief, and I think in a bipartisan way, that those were choices that the states and local governments would be making. One of the things that we have been hearing some about, besides the assertion of the former Secretary of Education that he has better lawyers than we do, I'm not sure that I agree with that. In fact, I would disagree with that. But there's been a lot of noise that the new law, ESSA, in requiring the standards be aligned to college entrance requirements, that there is some noise that the Federal Department of Education has implied that this will mean college and career ready as defined in the Race to the Top grant program. And around the country, many people see that, and I've already heard this many times, that that's sort of code for Common Core state standards. Certainly not my intent, nor I think our intent in a bipartisan way. But I want to go to Ms. Hoffmeister, if I could, because I'm looking at some notes here in front of me. We understand that Oklahoma has recently gone through a rewrite of its academic standards in consultation with its higher education system that has not resulted in Oklahoma adopting the Common Core. Can you walk us through what you did and how that works and how it might apply elsewhere?
Excuse me, yes, sir, thank you, Chairman. We certainly started out with a process where we wanted to make certain that our students would be competitive and that they would be ready for their next steps in learning, whether that's at the end of a grade level or at the end of their high school career, ready to take those next steps. And we do believe that there is need for that. What we did in Oklahoma was we partner together at each grade band level, starting with early childhood because we have pre-K. This is the first time we have vertically aligned pre-K through 12th grade standards, and we partnered with counterpart in higher education using subject matter experts as well as those familiar with pedagogy of teaching that subject. And we're working together combined effort on the writing teams. So we had co-chairs in math and English language arts that reflected both the common education system as well as higher education. And that partnership was one that has been successful. Just earlier on the first day of this month, we submitted those standards that included the input of hundreds of Oklahoma teachers and those members in higher ed as well.
So just to underscore this, because I'm afraid we're going to be hearing this again and again and again, you have gone through the rewrite of your academic standards in the collaborative way you've just described, and you ended up with standards that are not the Common Core. Is that correct?
Absolutely, they are not Common Core.
Nor did you feel compelled to make them Common Core.
That is correct, and we are a state who lost our waiver because we repealed Common Core and had to go through efforts to demonstrate that we had rigorous standards, and that was certified by our Higher Ed Board of Regents. Then we got to work writing the standards that Oklahoma needs for Oklahoma students.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ranking Member Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hoffmeister, it's my understanding that Oklahoma now has only 3 subgroups for performance and 2 for graduation. The subgroups that we expect to be evaluating would include ethnicity, English as a second language, disability, and low income. Will you be assessing students on all 4 subgroups in compliance with the law?
Yes, and thank you, Congressman. We do believe, and I have been in office for a year and have been critical of the particular accountability system that we have. It is actually one that was granted to us under a waiver, but it does mask the performance of our subgroup population. This is an area of concern for me. It's also an area that I think needs to have a greater exposure at the local level so that they can make the kinds of strategic plans to address the needs of those who are not performing to their full promise and potential in those subgroups. So yes, sir.
Thank you. And back to the question that the chairman asked about Common Core. You set the standards, but are the standards, if a student achieves the standards, will they be eligible for entrance in a state college?
Very important, thank you, Congressman. We want to be certain that students finish graduation and a diploma has great value and meaning, and a meaning that means they are able to begin with the credit-bearing coursework in a university or college or community college, or that they are ready to start work or continue work with credentialing in the industry and workforce area. So this is something that is we have great work to do in working to really eliminate and shrink the remediation gap that exists right now, and I do believe that we are on our way.
Thank you. Ms. Almazan, what authority does the federal government have under the bill if a state and local education system fails to graduate the requisite percentage of students, or they fail to achieve? What authority does the federal government have to come in and do something?
Well, we believe that the federal authority is there in Section 1111E of the ESSA, and it is well established under administrative law that the executive branch does have the authority to come in and help implement and interpret statutes and laws that have been promulgated. They have the authority to clarify as well as interpret and help to implement, because the executive branch does have the expertise in implementation.
Thank you. And Ms. Hoffmeister, what should be done if a school fails to achieve? What kind of, say on graduation rates, what kind of response should there be on a state and local basis for a school that's not achieving on graduation rates?
Thank you, Congressman. We need to have very good information so people can make good decisions. And some of those decisions are on how to address needs, but you don't have an opportunity to do that if you don't have that good information. So in our current situation, we had a accountability system that really masks that. That was approved by the Department of Education. And what we found was you could earn a letter grade of an A or a B and still have a graduation rate in your school of less than 67%. That's unacceptable. That's a problem. So we want to address that, and we now have a new way.
What kind of initiatives would take place if you see that, once you've unmasked the problem? One of the things that we wanted to do, both to assess, but then do something, what kinds of things can be done to improve the graduation rate?
Well, one example would be, first of all, I believe you have to start by building capacity within leaders. We can't all do it at the classroom level from the state. I believe that those closest to the problem have the best hope of solving it, and it involves bringing in strong leadership and building that. We are, I can give you an example of a school district, or a school, McLean High School, that was part of turnaround models of coming in and starting over with new people. And in a 25-year period had 18 new principals. That is a very drastic approach that is not working when you have 25 years later, you're in the same boat. We've got to plug stakeholders in to solving things, and they've got to be a part of it. It's about building capacity, and it's on, and truly the state has authority, but our authority needs to be in equipping and supporting, and then we will do whatever it takes to make certain that students are not left behind, and that they have an opportunity, all kids, an access, must have an, really access to that high quality education. But it starts with building capacity at the local level.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. We appreciate what you're doing. What you're doing for our students is extremely important. Ms. Hofmeister, let me start with you. You have the title of Superintendent of Public Instruction for the Oklahoma State Department of Education. So I'm assuming that you've seen different frameworks and different styles across the state. I could not help but sense in your opening statement that you question somewhat the devolution of power that we feel like we've done here at the federal level. I don't know if that was just my sense or if that's what you were trying to portray. Do you have some doubts? Because I just want to assure you, as someone who voted in favor of this bill, it's our intention that the power go back to the local governments.
Please don't mistake those comments in any way for not appreciating the return of the decisions that belong at the state level, where we embrace that. What I want you to hear very clearly is, number one, hold us accountable for results for kids, but don't tell us how we achieve that. We know at the state level as leaders what works best in our own states, and we share the goal of having every one of our children ready for their next steps in learning and truly having the full potential realized for them. And that's going to take a very strong partnership at local levels with stakeholders. So that is something that is very, very important to me, and it's actually something I ran on.
Well, let me ask you this then. Having said that, now that you do have this opportunity, what are you going to be recommending to help develop the freedom and the flexibility in the curriculum? Can you give me just a couple of examples of what you're going to be recommending to the public schools?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. First of all, what we did, because I was not happy with an accountability system that masked the performance of our subgroups, one where we do not have truly a light shown on how students are performing beyond a label, a collective label. We need to have, I think, the use of best practices, the latest of research science. So we commissioned work to be done with research scientists in our 2 research universities. This year I've been in an office for 1 year, so we have completed that. We are working also with, they had national reviewers look at that as well. We've got to look at what is it that are good measurements for outcomes for kids, successful outcomes for kids, and then we need to make sure we're measuring that. And that's something that should have flexibility over time to respond and react to new data and new information. When we have a system in place where our hands are bound and we have to wait for permission, then we are unable to accomplish.
Great. Dr. Wilson, you being from Alabama and me being from Georgia, we were very strongly independent and we want control. What are you going to be implementing? What are you going to be suggesting to your school systems? In your particular schools, you're boots on the ground there in the superintendent's office.
We've already begun to do that. We're trying to customize our education. We have 8 different academies. We have children who are leaving our campus. We have kids who are going to graduate with a welding degree. We have kids that are going to be dually enrolled. What we're trying to do is not only provide, college and career ready, but we're trying to provide the right college for students. We have conversations with children along the way, and if they tell us they want to do this, this, and this, but they want to go to a school that doesn't meet that, we want to help them get in there. Everything we do along the way helps get kids where they want to go and need to go. We are partnering. In fact, tomorrow we'll be mentioning something that we're partnering with Morgan County Schools. They have a wonderful auto tech. We have none. I don't have $1 million to spend on auto tech.
I'm very encouraged to hear that.
We're sending kids to Morgan County. They don't have some of the AP offerings we have. They're going to send them to us.
Great. We appreciate
we're working
what
together.
you're doing. Mr. Talbot, I just want to ask you, from your perspective, any words of wisdom to them as they implement this, as they go forward now?
Well, they are the boots on the ground, and so look to the text of the statute, watch what happens in negotiated rulemaking, watch what proposed regulations are put out there, and then read it, understand it, and then apply it.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you all.
I thank the gentleman. Ranking Member Fudge, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony today. Mr. Wilson, in your testimony, you state that, like politics, all education is local. I'm just curious. Do you see civil rights as a local issue?
I'm sorry.
Should a child's right to educational opportunity be left to local discretion, or is there a federal role in protecting the civil rights of every child?
Thank you. It's actually both. It's all of us. The civil rights is a local issue, it's a state issue, it's a national issue. So that is something that we're going to meet the kids where they are, find out what their needs are, help devise a plan to get them where they need to be, and help matriculate them through the process.
Thank you, but you agree it isn't a federal issue?
It's all of us. Yes, ma'am.
That's not my question.
Okay.
Is it a federal issue?
It's a federal issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Talbert, in 2008, during your tenure as General Counsel, the Bush administration issued new regulations requiring states to use a uniform graduation rate calculation for the purpose of accountability as required by No Child Left Behind. Why did you believe that it was necessary and appropriate for ED to use regulatory authority to define a term like graduation rate when the term wasn't fully defined in statute? So do you believe that the enactment of ESSA now makes similar clarification of statutory terms unnecessary?
Well, no, I mean, certainly ESSA sets forth definitions in the text of graduation rate, and so that's what should be adhered to. If it's not clear, then there may need to be clarity that's included in regulations, but it's in the text.
Ms. Hofmeister, ESSA aims to ensure that all students have the opportunity to attend a high-quality school. According to the Alliance for Excellent Education, if Oklahoma's graduation rate were to reach 90%, the new graduates would bring additional $69 million into the economy in earnings, leading to the creation of 500 jobs, and that's just for a single class. In Oklahoma, there are 24 high schools with an enrollment of at least 100 students, where 1/3 or more of the students do not graduate. Under ESSA, these schools are required to implement comprehensive, evidence-based interventions. Can you describe how your state would implement this provision and reap those benefits?
Sure, and it starts, thank you very much, Congressman, and it starts with essential elements that we know are evidence-based, that will work with local school leaders, and for some of them, it is a school principal that is serving in a dependent school district as a superintendent as well. So they're the instructional leader as well as dealing with regulation that befalls a superintendent as, on top of that. So it's about capacity again. The boots on the ground have to understand how to read the kind of information to guide smart decision-making. And that is where the department must be able to provide that kind of support. We have not seen the kind of success we would have expected to see in the years where, under No Child Left Behind, under the particular guidance that has been given federally, we have seen these schools not improving. So we have to ask the question of why. And I believe that the answer comes when we're able to make decisions that fit the community, the challenges specific to that community with the expertise and support at the state level. We are changing school turnaround in our office because that is something in the agency that has not been successful and has to be done differently, and we now have that flexibility to use best practices and evidence.
Thank you. Another question for you. You said that your current accountability system masks subgroup achievement, and that is unacceptable, and I agree with that. My question is there not a federal role in ensuring that other states don't have the same problem?
I think that this is something that every state leader bears that responsibility. It is not the responsibility of the federal government. It is the responsibility of our state to care and to provide the kind of resources.
What happens if it doesn't?
Well, I think that there is certainly a responsibility at the state level, and that's where...
what happens if they don't, is my question.
Well, we have seen under No Child Left Behind that whatever did happen did not work. And what
We're
is
talking
going
about
to be...
ESSA.
On ESSA, we now have the freedom to do what we perhaps at some states, and I can't speak for all states, but weren't able to do because our hands were tied. So I'll tell you what we'll do in Oklahoma. Okay. In Oklahoma, what we want to do is, first, you've got to have face-to-face meetings with people. You can't just provide some kind of centralized power that is going to actually make changes. It starts, and this may sound very simple, but it starts with relationships and trying to understand what people are facing and help educate those in local school districts to be able to really see a vision for where students can go that oftentimes it may be lacking because of inexperience, maybe because of a lack of appreciation for best practices, newest work and research, and it is a part of the state's obligation to provide that kind of professional development and support. But it takes a specific plan.
Expired. We'll now hear from the gentleman, the gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes. I'm sure we'll hear from him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not states are able to truly provide the level of detail, the quality of education for those with disabilities, lower income, those by ethnicity, and we hear this debate back and forth. I really have just brief questions. Ms. Hoffmeister, are you aware that Oklahoma has a higher overall graduation rate than, say, the state of Virginia?
Well, we certainly have a graduation rate above the national average, including our Native American population, which is the largest in the country.
Were you also aware that Oklahoma has a higher lower income graduation rate than, say, the state of Virginia?
I'm not familiar with.
Were you also aware that our disability graduation rate in Oklahoma ranks at 78.5% as opposed to 51.5% in, say, the state of Virginia? What I'm trying to make the point on here is that just because there are perceptions of flyover country or, different types of notions of what a quality education might be, we've shown that when states are empowered with the choices, not only are graduation rates higher, but we also see that in the areas of concern where we think that the federal government should have a stronger federal role, it's assumed that the states don't care about these populations, which is, I believe, absurd. Of course the states care about them, and I think Oklahoma, particularly when you look at disability graduation rates, I think leads the country in a lot of its outreach and the type of things that it's trying to do, for these subgroups. It might also be interesting to ask, were you aware that the unemployment rate in Oklahoma, meaning to translate from graduates to like the workforce, which is the stated goal of almost all of us, are you aware that Oklahoma's unemployment rate is also higher than, say, the state of Virginia?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hoffmeister. It's great having you here today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Bonamici of Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Fudge. I'm really glad that part of our discussion here today is how we uphold that civil rights legacy that was the original intent of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And certainly from all the work that we've done in this committee and the conference committee, there should be no question that the Every Student Succeeds Act is intended to carry on that legacy so that all students have access to high-quality education. ESSA advances this promise by continuing to target resources to underserved public schools, by committing federal funds to supplement, not supplant, local investments, and by requiring states to measure the progress of every student and hold each to high standards, and by expecting states to identify when some students are lagging behind their peers, and also by requiring states to take meaningful steps to close opportunity and achievement gaps when they're identified. Now, without question, No Child Left Behind largely missed the mark. It identified too many schools for intervention and prescribed interventions that were too rigid, but we shouldn't forget why Congress passed No Child Left Behind before that law. Some groups of students, like students with disabilities, could effectively disappear in some states' school systems. So setting parameters to guarantee each child's right to opportunities in public education is fundamentally a federal responsibility. So I respectfully disagree when some people say, as I believe in it's Dr. Wilson's testimony, that Every Student Succeeds Act intends for states to be solely responsible for decisions regarding accountability. I don't see that as accurate. The law establishes a lot of conditions to make sure accountability systems reflect the intent of Congress to identify and require action in schools where students are being underserved. And that's how Congress advances equity in education, and the Department of Education does have a clear role to play in interpreting statutory language and establishing parameters consistent with the law and within the scope of the law, of course, as has always been the case. I want to begin by dispelling a rumor that the Every Student Succeeds Act somehow nullifies the Department of Education's enforcement authority under the General Education Provisions Act, GEPA. So can you point, I'm going to ask Mr. Talbert and Ms. Almazan, can you point to any provision in the Every Student Succeeds Act that would alter, limit, or erode the U.S. Department of Education's authority as granted under GEPA to enforce compliance with federal education law?
The General Education Provisions Act certainly provides authority to the department, to take enforcement actions if necessary, and so that remains even with the ESSA.
Do you agree, Ms. Almazan?
I do agree, and going all the way back to the Administrative Procedures Act of 1946, absolutely.
In too many schools in my home state of Oregon and across the country, students don't have access to the resources they need, whether that's advanced coursework, adequate technology, classes in career and technical education, arts, STEM, et cetera. So the ESSA aims to close these gaps by not only providing extra federal resources, but also promoting more equitable allocation of state and local resources to low-performing schools that do need additional support to improve. So is the statutory language in the ESSA clear enough to ensure that equitable resources reach the schools that need the most support? And what can the department do in the regulations to ensure that those states and districts are addressing persistent resource inequities as intended by Congress? I'll ask Ms. Almazan that question.
Well, I do think the 1,062 pages, it is clear that the Department of Education retains the authority to regulate. I would have to get back to you on those specific items, but we did enumerate in our written testimony those items that we do want to see strengthened in Title I of the ESSA. And I also do want to draw your attention to that. It was on page 5, beginning on page 5 of our comments, our written testimony, and I touched on some of them in the oral testimony, but we are really looking for rigorous and consistent standards. We're looking for the strict state limit of 1% of all students. We are looking for definitions and parameters for those new statutory terms, such as meaningful differentiation, substantial weight, much greater weight. I think that the department we would need the guidance from the department on those areas. And looking at the history of going back to 1994 and No Child Left Behind, and
I'm sorry, Ms. Almazan, I'm going to try to get one quick question, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Wilson, probably have to submit your response for the record. But you've named many benefits of local control, but that has some risks too when you look at expectations for students in Hartselle, I hope I said that right, with under 10% of students of color and 30% low-income students. That might be different for districts where there are large concentrations of low-income students. So how can we make sure that states and districts will not take advantage of flexibility to lower expectations for some groups of students, especially in vulnerable communities? And because my time has expired, I'm going to ask you to submit the response. Thank you, Mr.
Gentlelady's
Chairman.
time's expired. Thank you, gentlemen. Gentlelady, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks to all the members of the panel for being here. It's an exciting time with what we've done with repealing No Child Left Behind, now with ESSA. We need to be working hard, and I appreciate the chairman doing this because our job is oversight. And because if without oversight, we will not achieve some of our intent that we had with ESSA that I find people are universally, whether it's parents, kids, teachers, administrators, school board members are very, very excited about. Clearly, we're all accountable for our children and for all aspects, including education. And I appreciate the trust that we have shown in this body and in Congress and with the President signing the legislation in really pushing the authority, the flexibility, and the control to the state levels. My request of all of our friends who work in state capitals have that same trust. Push that to the local level because they know that it's their children. They don't want their children to fail. They want their children to thrive. They want their children to get the type of education to where they can get great jobs, find those jobs in their home communities, and raise our grandchildren. I've always believed that there's many different pathways to success in life, not just a four-year institution. I do my best to work to try to make that affordable and accessible, but career and technical education. I've got a son and a daughter-in-law who've done great things in their education, earned it in the military. Many different paths, entry right into the workforce. Dr. Wilson, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of meeting the needs of students who are looking to embark on all different types of career pathways. And as co-chair of the Career and Technical Education Caucus, I believe that the preparation of our students for the 21st century workforce and 21st century jobs is vastly important. Now, how will local flexibility give educators the tools to empower students to develop more well-rounded leadership, academic, and technical skills?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. We live in the Huntsville area. Huntsville was just recently named one of the top 3 metro areas of its size in the United States. It has a wonderful economy, growing very quickly. We're in Workforce Region Development 2 in the state of Alabama. Part of my job is to understand the types of jobs that my students, when they graduate, will be receiving and going into those places. It's my job to do that. I work closely with Dr. Philip Cleveland, who is over workforce development and career tech at the State Department, and he is boots on the ground. He comes out and makes sure that we know what's going on in our areas. Our 7 county areas, we're competing to get our kids ready for those jobs. I don't want those jobs to have to be outsourced. So it's part of my job to do whatever I need to do within my curriculum to make sure if we need some pipe fitters on the Tennessee River area, we got a way to get a pipe fitter teacher. We've got welding teachers that do the very same thing. We want every one of our children, when they graduate, if they want to graduate and not go to college but go into the workforce, to be able to graduate with a certification of some sort. We have EMT on our campus beginning next year. We're looking at putting in CNA, Certified Nursing Assistant. If someone wants to go into the nursing, we have a wonderful health occupational academy that puts kids out into the nursing field. They can graduate and already be a CNA and be working as they go to college at the same time. So that's some of the flexibility that's provided to us. But going back to what was said earlier, it's about leaders and the leadership capacity within the district to take that flexibility and go with it. You have to be willing to do that. And ESSA is providing us that opportunity to do that.
Have you, my gut instinct is, I don't think a lot of our school districts have done this yet, but there's a couple other great resources out there. I was wondering if you have partnered with them yet. First of all, our workforce investment boards, who that was in 2014. This body put some great leadership into the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, and we put a real emphasis on those age 16 to 29 for the first time, the barriers they have to entering the workforce. I'd like to see our school districts partner more in a more robust way. And just recently, something I discovered, despite being a chairman of Agriculture Subcommittee, is our Office of Rural Economic Development with USDA has monies and programs designed around training and retraining of workforce, as well as basically workforce needs. And I think both of those would be great resources. It'd be a great collaboration. So I guess I'll ask if you're familiar with that, and if you're not, I guess I encourage all school districts to check those out.
We work closely with workforce development opportunities in Decatur, Morgan County area, and with Huntsville, and I will look up that and make sure that we're working with those as well.
Yeah, USDA was brand new to me as of last week with a forum I hosted. We had about 80 folks come out, and it was pretty exciting to find out what opportunities are there that most people don't know about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady from Massachusetts. Ms. Clark is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the panelists for being with us today. My question first is for you, Ms. Amazon. I am very concerned with some of the adversive behavior punishments that we see, including seclusion, restraint, expulsion, suspensions, which disproportionately affect students of color and students with disabilities. In Massachusetts, just in the last school year, we had 603 preschoolers suspended from their programs. I'm very grateful. We fought hard to have many of the trauma-informed practices included in the ESSA. And can you speak to COPA's regulatory recommendations in this area?
Sure. COPA has had a statement of principles for quite some time on restraint and seclusion, and it is something that COPA has been intricately involved in for quite some time, particularly working with Congressman Van Hollen in the introduction of Keep All Students Safe Act that has been introduced, I think, every session since 2009. The statistics, if you just look at the GAO study back from 2008 or 2009, are horrific, and the effect on children of being restrained or secluded in the manner that they're being restrained and secluded are very alarming. I looked at that data recently from your home state and was really shocked to see how many students had been suspended and expelled for behavior that is just typical, particularly for children of color. I have been a practicing attorney for nearly 30 years and primarily represent families of color, families who live in poverty. And it has always stunned me that they are disproportionately affected by these practices. We know all of the horrific things that can happen to children when they are restrained or when they are secluded. We know that schools at times are not equipped to manage behavior in a way that is authentic and that looks at the circumstances that students come from. I think that looking at the trauma informed practices is very important, something that frankly we're all just learning about. I think that very importantly, we have now raised to a national discussion the student resource officers in our school buildings with the effect of cell phone cameras, and we can see what those of us who have been on the ground representing families for many years have seen always in police reports and in expulsion proceedings and in discipline proceedings. Those cell phone videos expose for the world what those of us who have been in the trenches in civil rights have seen for many, many years.
And you said in your testimony that often the effect of no regulations means that the courts are left to be the experts. How do you see that particularly working if there weren't any further regulations in this area for families?
Well, we have a whole rich history in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, when there was a statute, a civil rights statute for people with disabilities that talked about people who were otherwise qualified, talked about people with disabilities, talked about reasonable accommodations, and we had no regulations. And people were forced to go to court, and courts were trying to interpret the statute. There were no regulations interpreting it. And the disability community took a page from the civil rights community and staged a takeover of a federal building for 28 days in San Francisco until they could get their regulations from HEW. And as a matter of fact—
Thank you so much. I want to get one question in for Mr. Talbert. During your tenure as general counsel, regulations were promulgated that gave states more flexibility to exempt recently arrived English learners from state assessments. This was an allowance that was clearly not defined in statute. Would it be fair to limit the Secretary's authority to issue regulations that actually provide more flexibility in key areas? And how is this any different from the Secretary's authority to issue other clarifications or interpretations of existing statute? And you may have to respond in writing since I'm about to expire.
Sure, I'll be happy to supplement my response in writing. But again, in essence, you see what the text says, and then if it needs clarifying, if there's some ambiguity, then there may be a need to write regulation to deal with that. With respect to guidance, if the department sought to issue guidance, they again would need to make sure that that is within the contours of the text of the statute and that it doesn't stray beyond into making new law, so to speak. But I'd be happy to supplement.
Gentleladies,
All right, thank you.
time's expired. Thank the gentlelady. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I'm doing a ranking over in the other committee, and so I appreciate being able to come in and have a chance to hear from all of you. Mr. Wilson, if I might just ask you more about this, because I know on the website on your school district states that the student population is a tremendous representation of diversity in ethnicity and socioeconomic levels, having approximately about 7% minority and 30% qualifying for free and reduced lunch programs. And also, school districts across your state enroll more than about 40% minority students and 50% low-income students. So I really wanted to ask you more about that. And from San Diego Unified School District, that's the largest city that I represent. I actually served on that board for 9 years, quite a few years ago. And nearly about 60% of the students there are low income. More than a quarter of the district's enrollment is limited to English proficient. We know that history has really told us strong federal guardrails to hold systems accountable for improving outcomes for all students, low income, students of color, are sometimes ignored. And even from my own experience a number of years ago, I know that sometimes we want to make sure that we're giving to all groups, whether or not they are the ones who are most vulnerable at any particular time. So you had testified that the role of the federal government is to simply support public schools by equally applying broad flexibility. And in that, as I understand it, there was no mention of the federal government's role in promoting educational equity. So part of my question is whether you feel that, at least from what your experience has been, and that equity has been achieved, that we don't really need to focus like a laser, I guess, on this issue. And I'm wondering whether we can learn from communities that are more homogeneous and well-resourced, whether or not they are really representative of our nation's public schools today.
Thank you. Schools are microcosms of the communities they represent. The diversity we have in Hartselle is the diversity we have in Hartselle because it is the footprint of Hartselle. I was a principal at Homewood High School, and Homewood High School is a suburban area just contiguous to Birmingham, and had diversity that one would look at that diversity and be very clear from the traditional sense of what is diversity. 60%, 25%, 10%, so forth and so on. When one looks at our diversity and sees 90% and then 10% of everything else, that is putting diversity back in the box of the traditional diversity. We have a lot of transients as well. It's not spoken and not seen in that diversity. That's the biggest issue we face. The biggest issue we face is a child who comes to us 1 month and then 3 months later goes somewhere else and then 3 months later comes back to us. We deal with those kids on a regular basis.
And of course, in many of these districts that are so heterogeneous,
That's
they have
correct.
that issue as well. I mean,
That's exactly right.
a basic part of it.
And to answer your question, it's an answer that you got to pinpoint the places where it's not working. And that's where extra care and concern has to go from either the local group, the state group, and if that doesn't work, that's when the federal steps in.
So you do see a federal role in that.
As I stated, there certainly is a role for the federal, but the boots on the ground at the local level and the state level is where I believe, having been in my situation.
What would you like to see the state doing then?
I like what the state's doing, essentially what the ESSA is doing, saying to local leaders, go out there and meet the needs and exceed the needs of the students in your area. Meet those needs. That's what you want to see. You want to see the ability to go out there and let that leadership capacity, don't hold me back, don't grab me, okay, because I'm wanting to move forward because everybody else isn't moving forward. At the same time, we're going to have to figure a way to prod those who won't move forward.
Yeah, and do you see that sometimes that means really difficult challenges or decisions that have to be made
It's the most difficult.
remove
It's the most difficult
services
challenge.
in some
It
cases
really is.
from other students?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Thank the gentlelady. Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Talbert. In your judgment, did the department, under the previous authorizing law, No Child Left Behind, promulgate any regulations that resulted in new requirements that were inconsistent with or outside the scope of No Child Left Behind?
You know, it's a hard question to answer, to think back everything we did.
That you're aware of.
You know, during that period. I mean, I can't say with certainty, but that I'm aware of.
And again, I think you touted in your testimony some of the provisions around ensuring that the federal government is prohibited from being involved with any requirement, direction, or mandate to adopt the Common Core standards. Where that prohibition didn't exist under the previous authorizing law, do you agree also that there was no specific authority given for the department to interfere with those decisions under the previous authorizing law either?
Correct, but they did have conditional waivers wherein certain conditions were added to waiver request. And so there were certain things where the department got into that.
And reclaiming my time, of course, the waiver authority wound up being what we used because of the failures in the underlying accountability metrics of the law. It essentially all became a waiver law. I don't think that was the original intent of Congress. It's why we're all grateful that we're here replacing it. Be happy to yield if you wanted to address that.
Sure. But again, I mean, the waiver authority, it exists to waive provisions. It does not exist to affirmatively add new conditions or requirements, and that was what was taking place.
My next question is for Superintendent Hoffmeister. I'm sure you're aware of research from the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State that showed that the Oklahoma's waiver accountability system, quote, hid low test performance of poor and minority students, end quote. In your argument, you testify with an argument for flexibility granted by waivers that allows you to strengthen accountability measures and that you need more flexibility under ESSA. How can we be sure that Oklahoma, and also more generally any state, is using the flexibility for the right reasons rather than the wrong reasons? How can we ensure that you and other superintendents at the state level don't take advantage of the flexibility to sweep low performance of some subgroups of students under the rug?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. And I think what you must look at is what we have done. I commissioned that study.
Well, and not asking, I don't mean this in an accusing way of Oklahoma. I mean, how can, at the federal level, how can we make sure that states are not using the flexibility for the wrong reasons?
I think the way you examine whether that is working is to hold states accountable for results for students. And that includes students in our protected groups. that is where we need to have a greater flashlight. And we've got to be able to keep up with the ways to view that and then respond with the most research-based new, if that is needed, intervention. But it's got to be acting on evidence, not anecdotal information or not perception. And I believe that we will do that. We are eager to do that. These are our kids. These are the future of our state.
And again, I mean, we at the state level, and obviously many of your district superintendents say we at the district level, at the building level, they say we at the building level, but we obviously here on this panel at the federal level, how do we, in dealing with the states, make sure that a state superintendent, state commissioner is not using the flexibility for the wrong reasons to kind of mask low performance of minority students?
Well, I think that we have to accept the fact that at the state level, I am held accountable to the people of the state of Oklahoma. And that is the way this works at the state level for each different state.
We're clearly my time. I mean, the fundamental problem in that, and getting back to the question of whether civil rights is a local, state, or federal concern, is yes, you're accountable to the voters. In our state, we have a state board that are, but you're not elected by a minority of the voters. You're elected by a majority of the voters, and yet you're accountable for a public education system that serves all students, including traditionally disenfranchised minorities and others who may or may not have voted for you, may or may not have voted for other people that run in the race. So there's more to it than just politics. There's a civil rights aspect that transcends politics. And that, of course, is our federal interest, as Dr. Wilson mentioned as well. I want to go to Ms. Almazan for the last 15 or 20 seconds. You'll have to answer this. But I wanted to ask about Title I regulations revolving alternative assessments and alternative achievement standards. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have found that allowing states some flexibility for students with disabilities has done this. What's at stake to make sure that we continue the proper accountability for students with disabilities? I think you'll have to submit that to me in writing, Ms. Almazan, but if we can talk about in writing that whole area of alternative assessments, and of course we maintain that cap in this new law. I'm very grateful for the time, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman's time's expired. I'll recognize myself now for 5 minutes. It's been a very interesting discussion. I want to thank each and every one of our witnesses again for their testimony. I want to focus on Dr. Wilson's testimony and the exchange with Ms. Davis from California. I want you to recognize that at the last few seconds, she said the only way sometimes that you can serve those that need it is by taking services away from others. And I want to make sure that it's recognized that that was her opinion and not necessarily your testimony. Unless it was, then say so.
That was not my testimony.
Right. I also find it amazing that only here in Washington can a man put on his website that he wants to treat everyone equally and that somehow be a bad thing. It's ridiculous. In fact, that's my opinion. Mr. Talbert, there was some discussion going on about the General Education Provision Act, and you were asked about that and how that did not, in fact, limit the Secretary's authority. I want to rehabilitate that discussion a little bit, because isn't it true that that act is basically the jurisdictional provision for the department? That is to say, the department will focus on education issues. In no way does the GEPA somehow nullify or limit a more specific statute, if you want to talk about rules of construction, like ESSA, that certainly, regarding specific areas, does limit the Secretary's authority, just as Congress intended. Sir?
Correct. It doesn't nullify those very specific provisions that deal more directly with the issues you mentioned.
Right. And by the way, while I have you, I had to cut you off because you were way too long. But is there anything in your written remarks that you want to take a minute right now to go and focus on?
Nothing other than just to reinforce the whole theme of the law, which is more state and local control, that indeed when the department was first set up in 1979-80, that was some of the findings and the purpose statements of that law specifically provided that state and locals have primary responsibility for education, and that the feds supplement that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And since you have experience in the department, and I've been listening to this exchange about clarifying things, in your experience at the department when you were there, was there ever a culture where you all took a perfectly defined part of the law, something that was specifically defined, and reinterpreted it, ignored it, or did something other than simply clarify ambiguous parts of the law?
No, you take the law as you have it, and then you seek to implement it to the best of your ability, and if it's necessary to clarify, you clarify it as well.
Right. No, when it's necessary to clarify, not when it doesn't suit your political ideology.
Correct.
Okay, and it's your opinion that the culture has changed at the department in that regard, or not? And you may
not
have
quite.
clients before the department, so I understand the sensitivity there, but I'd appreciate an honest answer.
So could you rephrase the question?
I'm known to be pretty direct, so I'm not sure I can do that. Let me go here. You mentioned negotiated rulemaking.
Right.
Is that a change from No Child Left Behind, and if so, what we might expect differently with rulemaking?
Well, sure. There were some changes in the statute as to negotiated rulemaking, and a requirement that once they come up with a rule, they need to submit it to the committees so that they can see it, look at it before it then goes public in the Federal Register. That's certainly one change.
Okay, and that's different around here. How specifically? How is it usually done?
Well, there was no previous provision. I mean, they could go straight from negotiated rulemaking. Once they get a consensus, they could go straight and publish it in the Federal Register with an NPRM without having to first check in.
Notice of proposed rulemaking for those watching at home, right? NPRM.
Sorry. Yes, notice of proposed rulemaking.
Right. So this is a good change or a reform and improvement or not?
Well, it gives a role for Congress, actually, in making sure that it follows the intent of the law.
Right. Thank you. In the time I have left, I'll ask if Ms. Hoffmeister from Oklahoma would like to add anything to the discussion she's heard.
Thank you very much, Chairman. This is about equity. It's about an equity issue for all kids to close achievement gaps, to close an opportunity gap that exists. And we at the state level stand ready to lead in that effort.
I thank you. I'll yield the balance of my time and recognize the ranking member for any closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Previously in the hearing, the gentleman from Oklahoma made some disparaging remarks about what he called the state of Virginia. I would just like to indicate that the Commonwealth of Virginia did extremely well and actually better than Oklahoma on the NAEP test, which is the standard for comparing jurisdictions across the country. I'd like to enter into the record the scores of each of the states. Virginia actually did better on each of the standards that he mentioned during his testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman. Let me first thank you all for being here. Certainly, I do agree that states need to be held accountable, which does, in fact, require an oversight role. But let me also say that there are a lot of problems in our states that have nothing to do with flexibility. Absolutely nothing. We put kids in crumbling buildings. We have class sizes that are too large. States continue to cut funding for K-12 education. A lot of what is wrong in our schools has nothing to do with flexibility. But I do agree that there is a role. Now, hopefully that role is limited, but it is clearly authorized and it is clearly necessary that the federal government ensure that every child has a right to a quality education. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Let me thank our witnesses again. I appreciate your passion. I appreciate your expertise, each one of you, and what you've brought to the table so far in your careers, and what's going to be expected of you going forward. We will be here. We'll be here as partners, perhaps. Maybe that's not the right word. Maybe it is. But we will be doing our congressional oversight function. I think this law, as one of the authors of it, moved the ball downfield a significant amount in terms of having Congress, Mr. Talbert, write its laws with more specificity so that there's less for the agency to do. Let's put it that way, or less that they should do. I think the ball was moved down the forward in the fact that, yes, accountability, we agree. As parents, as taxpayers, as voters, as leaders, elected or not, accountability is a good thing in life. But, Ms. Hoffmeister, it's going to be up to you now to decide what success is and what it looks like. And you'll be held accountable to your voters and taxpayers, and you too, Dr. Wilson. And that's the goal here. And we expect it to work well. We want it to work well because we're all in this together for the very same reasons, to have the next generation better off in every respect than we were, so that they can fight and serve in a 21st century world and when. And again, that's what brings us here today. I'd ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter sent this morning from a coalition of groups, the state and local ESSA Implementation Network, to Acting Secretary John King, urging him to honor that congressional intent that I just spoke of and that we talked about here this morning. The letter is signed by the National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the National Association of State Boards of Education, the National School Boards Association, AASA, the School Superintendents Association, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, and the National PTA. The letter states, quote, ESSA is clear, education decision-making now rests with the states and districts, and the federal role is to support and inform those decisions. So with no objection, I'll enter this into the record. Hearing no objection, the letter is inserted, and with that, I hear of no further business before the committee, and we are adjourned.